Chessman Dan. Day 8 of playing chess every day until I could beat someone with a stick. Today's chess recap, I started today with an Elo of 414 and ended my Elo at a 404. I played a little over 10 games today, probably too much in my opinion. The reason why I played so many games is I lost a lot. And upon reviewing my games, a noticeable trend has been I have lost due to me not being able to spot a checkmate opportunity and a weak endgame. Regardless, we press forward. It's only day 8, so progress is never linear, and I will not be deterred. In my last video, I stated how I was going to stay away from the Black King's Indian defense and just focus on principles. I'm going back to Black King's Indian defense. I like it. I just got to practice it. So you're going to see this final game in which I play it. And my opponent's going to start off with pawn e4. I respond with pawn to d6. And the idea of this is essentially if the pawn's king's Indian defense, you develop your knight to f6. And if my opponent was to push his pawn forward, my pawn at d6 will defend it. Here he develops his knight. I respond with knight to f6. He responds with knight to c3. In the past, I've seen the chess evaluation board where they do not, when he would not attack. However, the moment he goes there, defends his pawn. So I've been trying to keep that note that when my opponent does not develop, when I am playing Black King's Indian defense, and my opponent does not develop his knight or develops it in the wrong way, I should still take. Regardless, a little sidetrack. My opponent responds to knight c3. I respond with pawn to g6. My opponent then develops his bishop to c4. I respond with a bishop to g7. He responds with pawn to d3. I castle short side. Then my opponent develops bishop to e3. I respond with bishop to g7, 4, excuse me. My opponent castles king side. Thus far, even game. My opponent has more control of the center, but the King's Indian defense is an asymmetrical setup, so I'm not worried with it, controlling the center because the whole idea is to attack king side. I now respond pawn e5. My opponent responds with bishop to g5. And you're going to see shortly, I make a lot of mistakes this game, but my opponent just as much. Here, I take with the bishop. He takes with the queen. I was honestly, yeah, that's probably the better move. This is where I make my first mistake. I move my knight out to h5. That idea being I will put pressure on the queen. However, two things to notice. One, let's just go out here. I leave my queen hanging. And even if I wanted to attack the queen, I can't. So just in the first few moves, if we look at the evaluation, 50-50. Now, me hanging my queen, the evaluation boards goes to a 10.7% advantage for white. However, my opponent doesn't see it. If he doesn't see it, he doesn't want to. Maybe he thinks because my queen is being protected by the rook, he doesn't want to take with the bishop. However, take the queen. My opponent doesn't do that. I therefore push forward to pawn to d5. At this point, I don't notice either. If I would have noticed that my queen was hanging and noticed that my opponent didn't take, I should have taken with the bishop. My opponent defends his knight square bishop. Finally, I recognize that my queen is hanging and I take with the pawn. If we go to the evaluation board, right, my opponent has a 0.84% chance of, white has a 0.9 advantage. However, the moment my opponent takes with the pawn, it goes back to an even game. And now we're back to square even. So, from here, my opponent attacks bishop to b7, essentially forking my knight. I have no other option but to try to free it. He takes my knight. I take the bishop. He develops his knight to d5. I move out my rook to b8. He checks me. I move my king. He moves his knight to c6. I get a free hanging pawn. My opponent moves pawn to c4. I respond with knight to d4. If we go back to the evaluation board, it's still 50-50. So my opponent, based on my blunder, potential blunder, gave him the game, but my opponent doesn't recognize it either. That is something I really need to focus on if I want to do better, if I want to improve in chess. I can't be hanging my queen. Here, my opponent offers a rook change. I move. He checks me. I block. He moves his rook back. The idea with this was I was hoping, I saw a checkmate pattern, and if he were to keep it there, I would go here. So let's say he would have take, or he would just to say, the move, right? But the whole idea was if he wouldn't have moved any other piece, my opponent could have gone here. I would have taken. My opponent would have taken. Take, and that would have been checkmate. I calculated that. I genuinely was like, hey, I think this is a checkmate opportunity. However, my opponent moving his rook back prevented that, which was all fair play to him. Here, I moved my knight to f4. I figured at this point, if you look at the time, my opponent has a minute over me. I figured this wasn't the bad move. In fact, it's putting pressure on the g2 square. My opponent doesn't realize what he did. If we go back, evaluation board, 50-50. Ready? Mate in one. The whole idea was my opponent wanted to take my rook. However, what he didn't realize, checkmate. So this is just an example of my last game in which I've won. However, majority of my games haven't won. If we go back to my just my win-loss record for today, I think it starts right here at this individual right here. Lost. Played a lot of games, probably more than I should. I should probably stick to no more than 10 games just to prevent mental fatigue. However, I love chess. See ya.